Now, may I request to our project coordinator and head Regional Science Center Guwahati to please kindly uh, introduce our today's chief guest and also throw some light about today's program.
Thank you, Suresh. Thank you very much. A very good afternoon to all our viewers, and namaskar to Professor Anindya Sarkar. On behalf of the Regional Science Center Guwahati, which is one of the units of National Council of Science Museums, working under the Ministry of Culture, Government of India. I am Sujoy Majumdar, Project Coordinator and Head of the Center, welcomes all our viewers in today's online lecture on the topic UNESCO Heritage Site Dholavira, Rise and Fall of a 5,000 years old city. We would like to extend our sincere thanks to Professor Sarkar for his kind consent to become the speaker of today's online lecture. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
You may be aware that NCSM, being the leading science communicator in India, always stresses the dissemination of scientific knowledge and inculcation of scientific temper among the masses. To honor the same mandate of NCSM throughout the COVID pandemic period and still today, Regional Science Center Guwahati tried to remain connected with its client populace through its different online manifestations. Today's program is one of the incarnation of the same. So it was 27 July 2021, UNESCO announced the Harappan city of Dholavira in Kutch district of Gujarat as India's 40th World Heritage Site. Once the ruins on the Tropic of Cancer, now the pride of India. Discovered in 1986 by archaeologist Sri Jagatpati Joshi, Dholavira is one of the most remarkable and well-preserved urban settlements in South Asia. Excavation in different stages reveals that the city consisted of a fortified castle with attached fortified bailey and ceremonial ground and a fortified middle and lower town. A series of interconnected reservoirs tell us they had a very good knowledge in hydrology, and they know how to manage the water system. An extensive use of stone in construction and special burial structure made them special. Today, Professor Anindya Sarkar will tell us how these ancient people built such an advanced human settlement and why the city suddenly collapsed nearly 4,000 years back. He will also tell us how a team of researchers, of whom he was the leader, employed modern scientific methods to untangle the mystery of this city. But before that, let me introduce Professor Anindya Sarkar formally to our viewers. An acclaimed professor in his field, Sri Anindya Sarkar earned his master's in geology from Calcutta University and PhD from the Physical Research Laboratory, Ahmedabad. He served as a faculty member at Indian School of Mines, Dhanbad, and currently he is associated with IIT Kharagpur in the Department of Geology and Geophysics as a senior professor. His current interest includes isotope applications in understanding climate-culture relationship. He established country's first national stable isotope facility at IIT Kharagpur, and which was sponsored by Department of Science and Technology. He published more than 100 research articles in peer-reviewed journals and mentored large number of PhD and master's research students. And he is the recipient of Young Scientist Medal from Indian Society of Art Sciences and INSA. He was postdoctoral fellow at Cambridge University, JSPS fellow, and INSA Royal Society visiting fellow at University College London. He was visiting professor at Purdue University, Benjamin Meeker Chair Professor at Bristol University, and visiting professor at Academia Sinica, Taiwan. And he also received the National Mineral Award in 1999. He is also a fellow of Indian National Sciences Academy, New Delhi, Indian Academy of Sciences, Bangalore, and West Bengal Academy of Sciences. So, sir, with these words, now I would like to request Professor Sarkar to deliver his lecture. And also, for all the viewers, there will be a question and answer session after his lecture. So, please be with us and keep your questions ready for the discussion. Professor Sarkar, the stage is yours now. You may please proceed. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Thanks, Dr. Mojumdar. At the outset, I must thank National Council of Science Museum and Regional Science Center Guwahati for inviting me for giving this talk. I have been talking, or rather kind of trying to popularize archaeology, especially in the geoscientific community for some time. But this I found as an opportunity to disseminate or excite the young minds. I believe there will be some school and college students so that they understand that the archaeology which we consider, or in India people normally consider to be a subject of humanities related to history and things like that, but archaeology is actually a hardcore science. And in fact, history also has been, from a descriptive branch of studies, history has also become extremely scientific today. Okay, people are employing a variety of techniques to understand the past of the humankind or any nation. Now, what I have done today, I have decided to break my talk into three parts. In the beginning, I would like to briefly tell why and how these heritage World Heritage Site, what does it mean actually to us. The second part, I will be discussing about what kind of modern methods the scientists today employ to understand or unravel the archaeological mysteries. And finally, I will be discussing about the Dholavira in the context of the evolution of the Indus Valley civilization, how the civilization grew, and why, in particular, Dholavira had collapsed, as Dr. Mojumdar has said, about 4,000 years back. I also discuss in one slide that with this World Heritage tag, how our responsibility has also increased as far as the Dholavira is concerned. Now, as you all know, that United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, which we know as UNESCO, it has an intergovernmental committee for the protection of the world cultural and the natural heritage. Okay, as the way UNESCO defines this World Heritage Site are that this should be either cultural or natural heritage. They are priceless and irreplaceable assets, not only to each nation, but of humanity as a whole. And they are of outstanding universal value, worthy of special protection against the dangers which increasingly threaten them. And this danger could be natural threat, this danger could be even what we call man-made, anthropogenic also. As you all know that now for last 1 or 2 weeks, it was Afghanistan is in the what you call the news headline, and all of you know that the Bamiyan Buddhas are in great danger in Afghanistan. And likewise, it has also happened in many parts of the Middle East, for example, in the Syria, in Jordan, and many other places where very valuable what you call archaeological remains have been either destroyed or are in peril because of the human intervention. So this is what UNESCO thinks that the World Heritage Site should actually mean. And if you look on a global map, there are about 1154 World Heritage Site, so far. And as you can see here, the red ones are the sites which are endangered sites. Okay, you can see that in the western part of India, there is this red dot, what I am drawing, the arrow, that is the latest tag of Dholavira, which has been added to this list of World Heritage Site. Indeed, a great pride for India. But this pride comes after a very, very long, work of, or very arduous work of Archaeological Survey of India principally, and later on by some work from different groups who have been working in Dholavira from different institutes as well as universities. So therefore, this nomination of Dholavira was there for some time, and as you know, they have as I mentioned, that they have very strict criteria for identifying them as a World Heritage Site. And after a lot of deliberations, a lot of queries between Archaeological Survey of India and the UNESCO, on 27 July, in its extended 44th session of the World Heritage Committee, Dholavira was selected along with 13 other cultural sites across the globe. So there were 13 other sites also in different countries. In India also, there was another in southern India, Ramappa Temple. And the citation for the Dholavira says exactly this. I just quote and unquote a very particular pertinent line. The ancient city of Dholavira between 3000 to 1500 BCE, before Christian era, is one of the best preserved urban settlements in Southeast Asia. And they acknowledged it with also reminding us in their interim report that once the heritage site is given, lot more to do in the coming days in order to preserve this heritage site for our future generation. Okay, so let me just start with a time scale of how human endeavors have changed over last 3 million years since the genus Homo sapiens appeared somewhere around 2.8 million years before present. There was evolution. There was oldest human permanent settlement somewhere around 50,000 years. Incidentally, this, when I say BP, it stands for before present. If I consider 0, so we are going 50,000. I will be using it time and again. So before present. So this is the time frame when the oldest human permanent settlements, trial cultivation, cave paintings were there. In India also there are many cave paintings. Then came what you call the hunting gathering. Then very early cultivations were there. In the Neolithic, the early farming cultivation of the barley and wheat begins. The Chalcolithic period starts around 3700 BCE to 3000 BCE, where the first Mesopotamian writing, copper-bladed axe, what you see in the England, the Stonehenge constructions, and also man started making potteries. And of our interest of today is what we call it as the Bronze Age. Okay, that is roughly about 3,300 years BCE. Add about another approximately 2,000 years, means about 5,300 years back, the Indus Valley civilization starts. Variously, in different places across the continent, subcontinent, the initiation of the Indus Valley civilization varied. Somewhere it is at 5,500 years. In Virana, while working, we found that the very earliest Hakra level of the Indus Valley civilizations can go even up to 7,000 years or so. And following this, you have the Iron Age, and followed by the recorded history, which is represented by classical, medieval, and the modern history. Now, as I said, that I will briefly tell, principally for the school and the college students, that how does one unravel the mystery of the past. All kinds of modern techniques are used. One of the technique known as LIDAR, that is known as the Light Detection and Ranging Survey, which is commonly used for surveying geomorphology, the landscape, and things like that. Even civil engineers use it. The naval engineers, architects, they use it. That technique basically uses the laser scans, and in 2018, these laser scans revealed a Mayan megapolis below the jungle of the Guatemala, and which was later found to be about 4,000 years old. Okay, and these are kind of first-hand survey which are done where nothing is known over the years. Obviously, as you understand that these techniques are costly, often it may not be possible to employ at many places. But these are the kind of techniques which people are using increasingly for finding out the archaeological remains, especially in very, very inaccessible areas. Now, once this kind of archaeological remains are found, in majority of the cases, the ancient settlements, human settlements, are covered, and they are represented in terms of a mound, is a kind of low hillock, and below which the archaeological remains are found. For example, in Bengal, there is a very, very famous place. We call it the Ballal Sen's Dhipi. Dhipi, in the sense, is a mound, and Ballal Sen's Dhipi is essentially in Bengal, below which the remains of the Shen dynasty was found after the excavations. So this is a picture of how the mounds actually look like before it is excavated and after it is excavated. For example, in the left side here, this is how it was. Okay, so it was just like a hillock. Nobody knows, people will walk over through it until it is excavated as it is shown in the right hand side, and slowly unearth the hidden treasure below these archaeological mounds. And once you start excavating, it's like a book that you open pages after pages of the human settlement as you go down below. So you start from the top, you go here, you go here, you go here, you keep on going down and retrieve many, many new things. Okay. For example, if you look at Dholavira, the excavation started somewhere around 89-90, and it went up to 2005. So you can imagine it's a 15 long years spread over 13 field seasons of Archaeological Survey of India that actually gave rise to what you see today on Dholavira. Okay. And conventionally, because particularly in the tropics, because we have a lot of rains, there is a possibility of getting all these things destroyed. Most of the time, once they are, once they are uncovered, once they are studied, after the study and documentation, many places they cover it up again. Okay, so this is how it goes. And then once you are having a successive layers, it is more like a geology that if you go from bottom to top, you have a number of strata. So if you consider this is the top strata, which is the youngest, and the bottommost strata, which is the oldest. So you make trenches. So you make one trench, you make another trench, you make another trench, you make another, a number of trenches you make. And here depending on the characteristic of the layers, you correlate them. As it is shown here as what you call by the colors, the archaeologists use them, make this correlation by using the cultural similarity. That means the culture in this level, culture in this level, culture in this level, and culture in this level is the same. Okay? Although it is not as simple as it is shown here, because remember that archaeological settlements are human settlements, there are disturbances, so therefore many of the times exactly these kind of correlations are not possible. But nevertheless, we try to do as much as correlations and possible, try to repeat. Now, as you dig below, what you get a variety of archaeological artifacts. You get potteries, you get bangles, you get tools, you get seals, you get food grains, and many more. You also unearth the architecture of the settlements, like you find out the roads, you find out the houses and the plans of the houses, you find out the cemeteries, that is the burial grounds. All kinds of things are slowly unearthed as the archaeologists excavate. While they do it, once these materials are obtained, one of the key questions that the archaeologists would like to ask is how old these layers are. That means if you go to the lowermost stratum and the uppermost stratum, how old these stratum are. And you can use a variety of technique to know their ages. One of the common age which is used or has been used by the archaeologists for a long time are radiocarbon ages. Earlier it was conventional radiocarbon ages, which required a lot of samples. Many of the time archaeologists may not be able to provide so much of sample. But today we have a very advanced technique called accelerator mass spectrometry. The top one is one which we have at Physical Research Laboratory, Ahmedabad. We have also in Delhi the Accelerator Center, who also does the same thing. So today these are two major centers which are catering to the needs of the archaeologists and also, of course, the geoscientists of various domains. What kind of things you use? You use basically either the carbonized cereals, here for example, the wheats which have been completely carbonized because they are so old, but they have enough carbon and they can be dated. But you can date a variety of things. You can date a shell, you can date a bone, you can date many things you can date which has a carbon inside it. And the fundamentals of carbon dating, I won't go in detail. That in the atmosphere you have a NP reaction where the nitrogen gets converted to 14C. This radioactive carbon is combined with the oxygen and forms 14CO2. This 14CO2 is either it goes into the food chain, or it is we breathe this CO2 inside us and fix this 14CO2 in our body. And therefore, a biological system, after inheriting this 14CO2 and after it is dead, this 14CO2 again decays back, and depending on what you call the half-life of any radioactive isotope, one can determine the age. For carbon-14, for example, the half-life is a specific 5,000 some years. So while by this means we get the radiocarbon ages of vegetation matter, the cereals, the bones, the teeth, and so on and so forth, there are other materials which also need to be dated simultaneously. And it is important because if you employ two different dating techniques, both of them are giving the same age, the confidence goes high enough. And the other method is known as the optically stimulated luminescence dating technique. Principally, it is a method of measuring radiation doses, and by this method, one can date the potteries, for example. As you can see here, this is from Sanauli, one of the archaeological excavation site of UP. These archaeological potteries can be very reliably dated by optically stimulated luminescence. And if in these pots, if you are getting, for example, the food grains like carbonized wheat or carbonized rice, you can also date them by radiocarbon method. basically they should give the same age. Okay, if they are coming from the same time, so they will give the same age. These concordant ages, you will essentially define the age of the stratum or age of that cultural level. Further, you also employ another set of techniques by which you use various stable isotopes for studying the archaeology. As such, as you know that the lighter elements like oxygen, carbon, nitrogen, they have a lot of isotopes. Oxygen particularly, for example, you have principally two major isotopes, one oxygen 16 and oxygen 18. Their relative ratios are tracers of studying various natural and physicochemical processes. This can be anything from planetary science to agriculture, for example, photosynthetic processes, the food web. They have a lot of use in medicines, they have use in hydrology, they have use in climate change, and of course they have use, very strong use in forensic science as the same technique which they use for archaeology. Okay? And when I say forensic science and archaeology, because if you go to many of the forensic labs, including the Federal Bureau of Investigations, they have a very advanced isotope labs to study various kinds of crime. Okay, these are some of the pictures from a very famous case of a little girl who was killed and whose body was found in the east coast of USA. And by using the isotopes of the victim of these dead bodies, what you call the hairs, the nail, or the teeth, it was possible to identify the place where this little girl unfortunately was killed. And then it was also possible to eventually nab the criminal. So it's like a kind of detective, but the scientists who are trying to study the archaeological remains, they work like a detective, fingerprinting, to find out what had happened in our ancient past. As I said, what kind of material they have? You have bones and teeth, like as I have shown here. You have skeletons, you have various kinds of animal bones and teeth. This is, for example, a cattle bone, this is the deer teeth. You also get a lot of shells, which are essentially calcium carbonate. Remember, it also has carbon. And you can study these materials for their isotope for studying a variety of things. You can study these materials from million years to recent or sub-recent scale for studying the processes in which these bone, teeth, or shells were grown in natural conditions when they were alive. For example, if you look at the bone, it is a kind of composite material consisting about 60 weight percentages of the hydroxyapatite. Okay, as you can see, and you can see that you have a carbon here, you have a carbon here, you have oxygen here, you have an oxygen here. Okay, and of course it has 40% collagen. Many of the times the collagen gets destroyed because it's a protein, it is not very stable. But some material in this hydroxyapatite remains, and you can actually study their isotopes in order to talk about many things. Okay. You also have, as I said, calcium carbonate, in which you have the carbon and you have the oxygen, and you can also study their isotopes for what you call retrieving many of the past processes. Okay. So what this tracers tells you? For example, if you are studying hydrogen and oxygen isotope, you can talk about the past climate change. When I say climate, you can talk about the rain, droughts, temperature, and so on. One can talk about the migration. That means, where did people come from? Was there any mixing between the Mesopotamian population and the Indus Valley civilization population? What they used to eat, their paleo diet, and so on and so forth. All of these questions can be addressed by using these isotope tracers very, very effectively, and has been a kind of center stage for studying many of the archaeological remains. Now, what is the interrelationship between the isotopes and climate? Here, for example, it is a animation of, for example, oxygen isotope. Never mind about the notations. Imagine that this is called a delta 18 or some kind of notation. But the color scale, color code actually presents the variation of the composition, monthly variation of the composition of the rainwater in over different continents. Okay, and as you can see here, from January to February to March till December, continuously the precipitation water actually changes. Okay, and this changes essentially because of the climatic pattern which is existing here. All kinds, for example, monsoon here, when we are talking about here, the monsoon plays a very, very important role in changing the oxygen isotope in the precipitation over the Indian subcontinent. Okay, meaning that every place has a very specific signature of water preserved in their water isotopic composition. If that is the case, then how the whole system get translated into the archaeological remains? You have, for example, mammals, okay, which is drinking the water, or you have the shells which are living inside a pond or a lake or in an ocean, and these water has certain oxygen isotopic composition that gets preserved into their bones and tooth and what you call shells. These drinking water is nothing but, or the ambient water is nothing but the water which is there in the rainfall. If you take, for example, the water of Calcutta or water of Delhi, the average water in Calcutta and Delhi would represent the average mean annual rainwater isotopic composition. Okay, so in a way, if you are measuring the isotopic composition of bone, tooth, or shells, you can retrieve the rainfall, or if the organism is living inside the ocean, you can talk about the ocean water, and so on and so forth. If you are analyzing a bone, the total bone, if you are analyzing, you will get a long-term average isotopic composition. If you are analyzing, for example, a tooth, as you know, the tooth grows in layers as it is shown here. As you can see here, it has a beautiful growth layers. Or here is a marine shell, which is known as the Turbinella pyrum, found aplenty in many of the Indus Valley civilization sites. If you cut them, they will also have, I will show some sections, they will also have this kind of growth ring. So it is the initial stage, for example, when a child is growing, and then slowly as he ages up, his teeth is growing. And if you can, by some means, if you can analyze each of these points, eventually you can talk about the seasonality. So a long-term average plus seasonality, you get a very detailed record of the oxygen isotopic composition, or in other words, you can get some idea about the local precipitation at a particular place in which either these mammalian species were growing or the shell species were growing, and so on and so forth. I must tell you that there are a lot of complications, okay? There are complications of isotope modifications by modern climate processes. I am not going into detail, but overall, it is possible to retrieve about the past precipitation by using these isotopes, okay? For example, as I was telling that if you cut a mollusk shell, a Turbinella pyrum, you will see exactly like tooth, you will see this kind of growth layers. It starts here and it grows here. Okay? And what you do in today, you use a very small focused laser. Here is a laser, as you can see in our lab, where I can blast this part and generate carbon dioxide, which can be measured for their isotopic composition. I go from here to here to here. And here I can retrieve a variety of things which can be translated, for example, here in terms of temperature. Now this just I give an example, is an hypothetical case. If you consider, for example, the Indian Ocean, which has a seasonal variation like this, from January to December, and a marine shell which is growing in Indian Ocean, if I can collect it, cut it, polish it, analyze in my laser point by point, I will be getting this periodicities preserved. So therefore, if you get an archaeological shell, and if you can execute the same experiments, one would be able to identify the past temperature, past seasonality, and all kinds of things in the ancient past. So these are some of the modern techniques which are being increasingly employed, which are otherwise employed for many other purposes in geoscientific research. Okay, almost identical set of instruments, identical sets of physicochemical principles are employed also in the archaeological science. Okay. Now, as I was telling that you blast them by laser. Let me just sorry. Let me just erase this. As I was telling that you generate what you call, you generate, you blast these individual spores and you generate carbon dioxide. Okay, these carbon dioxides are ionized in a mass spectrometer source. This ionized beam is passed through a magnet, and at least the high school students or the college students would know that if an ionized particle passes through a magnetic field, it gets deflected, and depending on the mass, which is actually the isotopic molecules which we are talking, they will be deflected at various, radius of curvature. So therefore, if you can put a detector here, detector here, detector here, you can count them. And by this means, you can actually measure the isotopic composition. Very interesting indeed, but it has been such a routine thing which is being used for last almost 40-50 years since I would say the Harold Urey discovered, the Nobel laureate discovered the deuterium way back. Now coming back to our archaeological business, I have given a brief idea that what are the modern things which we are using. Now, Bronze Age settlements, 5,300 to 3,500 or 3,300, variously as I said, but this is the time period. And if you see during this time period, a number of civilizations had actually flourished across the globe. In particular, in Asia and in Middle East, if you consider, these are the major civilizations which were almost contemporary. The Egyptian civilization, the Mesopotamian civilization, Indus Valley civilization, and the Yangtze River civilization, which was on the floodplains of the Yangtze in China. Okay, I had been in Taiwan during last year, and I see that in Taiwan also they have nearly 4,000 years or even older civilizations, even in the tiny islands. Okay, but these are, and probably that would be kind of contemporary to these Chinese civilizations. So these are the kind of spreads, and our story today will be confined only to these major civilizations in the Asia. Now, this Indus Valley civilization is a splendid, is a magnificent civilization which was spread over such a large area, which appeared at a certain time of the Earth history and which collapsed also at a certain time. So people have been very, very curious for a long time to know that what happened to the Indus Valley civilization. Why did it flourish? Why did it start, and why it collapsed after a certain time? Many theories. If you look at if you Google it, you will see there are many, many theories. One of the theory is basically a prolonged drought. So there was a major drought which was basically responsible for driving this driving the collapse of these. The other, for example, the scientists at Johns Hopkins University, they had studied a very great detail of the paleobiology. For example, this skull has a deep cut mark, as you can see here. Very, very deep cut mark. Very deep cut mark here, as you can see. Okay? And they conjectured that probably, and also if you go to many places, you will see this kind of mass burials. Okay? A lot of people were buried together. So they said that probably the interpersonal violence could be another reason that they went extinct. There were other that where people had studied the biology of the bones and which indicate widespread occurrences of the infectious diseases like leprosy and things like that. All of these or various kinds have been proposed for a very long time, but dominantly, as it is coming out and as you will see later, that be it is the resource crunch for which the interpersonal rivalry was there or the infectious disease, in all likelihood, they were all driven by a major climatic shift during this time. So let us try to look at those what had actually happened. Now, if you look at the map of what you call Gujarat and Kutch, you will see that these dots actually give lot of what you call points which are basically indicating the Indus Valley civilization site, small or big. Some of them are small. For example, Junikuran, these that they are not very large. Okay, Lothal, many of you must have heard. For example, Lothal is a very important and touristic thing and things like that. Rosdi, for example, another. Okay, Kotadaballi is another. So you have a lot of actually archaeological Indus Valley sites in this. Very surprisingly, lot. Gujarat is very rich in archaeological remains, and out of this, the so-called Indus Valley civilization, the largest one, of course, have been what you call unearthed in Dholavira, which is deep inside the run of Kutch. These Dholavira, as Dr. Majumdar has said, that in 1968, it was discovered by the then ASI Director General J.P. Joshi, and later on, Dr. R.S. Beast, is a Padma Shri R.S. Beast, who started excavating in 1989 and is the key person along with Y.S. Raut of the Archaeological Survey of India. They had excavated Dholavira over a period of what you call 15 years, as I mentioned earlier. It is due to their credit that today Dholavira has come to the limelight, and today Dholavira has actually got the World Heritage tag. Now, interestingly, if you look at the landscape, this is very funny. The whole run of Kutch has this kind of islands. These islands are represented by very old rocks, hundreds of millions years of old Jurassic rocks. Okay, these are called beds. Okay, and as you can see here, that this is an extremely dry climate. Extremely dry climate. If you look here in the left-hand side, you have an overall map of the subcontinent. You can see here, for example, Mohenjo-daro is here. Your Harappa is somewhere in the north. All these dots are basically the Indus Valley civilization sites. And archaeologists have found out a very interesting observation that from early Harappan to the late Harappan, the human settlements had moved from west to east. Okay? They had initially started building up here and they started moving here. At least the number of settlements and the frequencies suggest that. We have huge Thought Desert, as you can see here. Okay, virtually no river. You have a very one river, Luni River. You have the Indus River here. In this region where Dholavira is there, today there is no river. Okay, and if you look at the right-hand map, you will see these dotted lines are nothing but the rainfall isohyets. Just imagine that in Bengal and in the India, in general, in southern or the central India, Kerala and Bengal, the annual rainfall, if it is 1000 to 1200 millimeter, you see that you are entering in Kutch region, which is somewhere around 500 millimeter of the rainfall. So you are entering into so-called arid zone. By the time you go to the, what you call, you go to the Dholavira and beyond, you are actually in a hyper-arid zone. Hyper-arid means where the rainfall is even less than probably 100 millimeter. Absolutely no rainfall at all. Okay. Now, it is therefore, it's very interesting. And of course, this is also the southern margin of the Thought Desert. The monsoon which comes, southwest monsoon, does not reach here so much so forth. So it is very interesting that how and why the Dholavirans had built up such a magnificent township here. Let us just quickly look at the Dholavira and its magnificent, what you call, architecture. As I said, here you have a fortification wall. That means they were making wall outside the town. If you look at a Google map, as Dr. Mojumdar was telling, you have a middle town, you have a lower town, you have a bailey, and most importantly, the central part, you have the castle. That is where probably the most important people were living. And this whole township, this is about 200 meters, the whole township, they had built up a reservoir here, which is known as the Eastern Reservoir. They built up a reservoir here. And this was bound on eastern side and western side by two rivers which are completely dry today. This is the dry bed of river Manhar, is the dry bed of river Mansar. Okay? If you look at just a topographical map, you will see that this is what actually it looks like. That on the high ground, the castle was built, the middle town was built, and reservoirs were built on a lower ground. Meaning that if any rainwater falls on the high ground, the rainwater will go to these reservoirs and these reservoirs. And incidentally, these reservoirs also, they made connections in order to conserve the water. I will not go into the detail of that because it will take 2 hours of lectures, but magnificent water conservation system. Away from the township, they had the cemetery here, okay, where the burial grounds were there. This is what you call the, let me again, days. This is what is the present day dry bed of river Manhar, okay. As you can see here, only during the peak of the monsoon, some little muddy water comes in this river. But otherwise, it is completely dry. Okay. If you go and enter into the system, this is the east-facing entry gate. They have fantastic pillar element, as you can see here. Okay. Probably there was a gate which used to open by using this pillar. You have arterial road, a central road which is going through the township. On either side you can see the houses, and you can see that there are fantastic, what you call, planned house. It's an excellent 3 BHK to 4 BHK rooms which you find in Delhi, Calcutta, Mumbai. So you can imagine the kind of neatness and extensive architectural planning they had so way back in time. As I said, an excellent water management system. They had wells, they had water tanks, they had step wells, they had extensive drainage system, as you can see in the left side, and even manholes. Okay, as you can see here in the right hand side, as Dr. Bish writes in his report that there are a lot of manholes, they were using it extensively. They also built large reservoirs, very, very large reservoirs. You have heard about the bath of Mohenjo-daro and things like that. This is no less spectacular than that. You can see, if I little bit zoom out, you can see the steps through which they could come down to the bottom of these reservoirs. Okay. Excellent pots and the potsherds. They were making beautiful pots. Many of them were decorated, perforated jars, and so on and so forth. A kind of evolution of the potteries can also be seen in the Dholavira. They had a variety of ornamental beads. The women and the men probably were fond of ornaments. Today's ladies would have been, jumping to get this kind of ornaments. And those ornaments are made up of not from one kind, but from variety of kinds. For example, carnelian, amazonite, mudstone, lapis lazuli, and things like that. They had variety of seals. Okay, this is a typical seal of Indus style of the Dholavira on the left side. They used to make extensive shell bangles from the Turbinella pyrum shells which I showed you. They used to catch them from somewhere, bring them, and there was extensive such bangle making industry during the Indus Valley civilization time. They used to make human figurines, animal figurines likewise, and they had precise knowledge about the weights. The right hand side you can see the weights, from a very large weight to a very tiny weight. So they must be having some idea, I do not know, about the numbering system also. If you look at the metals, as far as the Bronze Age metals are concerned, you can see that they had the copper crucibles, they had the fish hooks, they had the spearheads made of all coppers, they had the lead artifacts, even gold, and also the silver coils. Excellent, metal pieces and workmanship. There are scientists who have actually studied the isotopes of lead in these copper ores, and they found out that probably these copper ores were being brought from far off places of Gujarat, Haryana, Rajasthan, or maybe from the Oman. Okay? How were they bringing? That is another mystery. How they used to exchange the materials, another mystery. Whether they were coming through the land route or whether they were coming to the sea route. But all in all, it shows that because the Dholavira and the nearby region doesn't have much of copper ore deposits. So they were being brought from outside. And this is the most intriguing thing which has not been solved yet. This is the mankind's oldest signboard made of mineral gypsum. As you can see here, this signboard has not yet been deciphered. What does it mean? It still lies in the Museum of Dholavira, but this is still, people are waiting for deciphering what does it actually mean. The burial grounds, as I was telling, outside the town, the cemetery region, when they were excavated, a very elaborate arrangement for the offerings after the death were found, and this kind of cemeteries have been found in large number around the Dholavira. Okay. The mystery is that how did they build such magnificent city in the remote desert? Not the Thought Desert. You are lying right within the Run of Kutch White Desert. How did they build? To do that, a team of us from Deccan College Pune, PRL Ahmedabad, Kutch University Bhuj, and IIT Kharagpur had landed. We had been working for last several years. Our work is still continuing. And with the active help of Dr. R.S. Bist and Y.S. Rawat, we have been able to access many of the materials of the Dholavira, okay, to probe what actually happened during this past. Now, in brief, as I was telling about the trenches, this is one trench which was made in the castle. This is another trench in the center which is made in the bailey. And you can see the cultural elements. Okay, the different colors means different cultural elements. In a nutshell, the Dholavira culture, the Dholavira whole human settlement of Indus Valley time started somewhere around 5,500 years. But interestingly, there is a pre-Dholavira culture. Okay, we have not been able to date them because we did not get any material which can be used for dating. So in a way, the settlement in Dholavira could be even older than 5,500 years. So people were already living there. It would be a further interesting thing to work out whether these Indus Valley people evolved here itself or they came from somewhere else. Okay, but just to note that there were habitation even before them. Anyway, so around 5,500 years they start building. When they start building, they had what we call the mud brick walls. The bricks which they are using, they were made up of muds. Between 4,800 years to somewhere around 4,300 years, they had a rapid expansion of these towns. They learned how to use the stone brick from the mud brick. The walls which were mud brick wall, they were transforming, as you have seen in my very first slide of the entry gate, into the stone bricks. Okay. And they were expanding the city like anything. Okay. All the cultural elements which I have shown, they are all found during this period. But very funnily, something happened. Archaeologists find that somewhere around 4,300 years, which we have dated now, suddenly the expansion of the city stops. And by about 4,200 years, suddenly the city collapses. They could not maintain the city. The walls were collapsing. The cultural materials were degrading. They were not being able to make such beautiful cultural elements, what I have discussed, from beads to potteries to metal makings. Nothing was happening. And eventually the whole city was kind of deserted around 4,200 years back. There was a hiatus, break. They come back after 200, 300 years, and they built on the top of it, as you can see here, on the top of it here, which they call it stage 7, they come back, people come back. But these people and the people who were living before, they had no similarity. These people did not know how to make houses like Dholavirans. They were making some kind of rounded huts. Okay, their cultural elements were poor, their potteries were poor. In a way, they forgot what their predecessors had actually done. So there is a disconnect. Interesting. There is a rapid expansion. For about 15 to 1700 years, people had continuously lived at this place, and at around 4,200 years, suddenly everything collapses. Mystery. We wanted to know what happened. Was climate a factor, as we have been suspecting for a very, very long time? Okay. As I said that the city completely collapsed in the early part of the late Harappan period, that is about 4,200 years back, and the city was abandoned. After 3,900 years, new habitation started, but they were not Harappans. They had poor architecture and they had poor cultural elements. Very, very interesting, very, very interesting things. We wanted to get hold of the climatic business. Okay. We are not, at least at IIT Kharagpur Group, are not archaeologists. We always take help of the archaeologists. What we find in Dholavira, this particular thing, what you see in the left side, is a shell which have been found in this Dholavira plenty at different cultural levels. Today, if you go, you will find these shells are living in the mangroves. And these shells are very important food source of many communities. You know that the muscle cells human beings eat. So likewise, they also eat the flesh of these. Many communities eat. And it is these shells which were growing in this mangrove water, in this Dholavira, and they were found. Now the question is that what kind of climatic signal these shells were preserving during this entire time? As I have said you earlier, that these shells grow, with the season. As the GIF animation is showing in the left-hand side, that from the top at the spire of the shell, when it is juvenile, it starts growing, and as the season progresses, it grows on. Okay. So if a shell is living for 1 year, it will pass through the seasonality, and it eats calcium carbonate. It will preserve its oxygen isotopic composition. Okay. So the water which you are finding here, H2O, the calcium carbonate which is there, the isotopes will be exchanged. Eventually, they will be fixed in the hard calcium carbonate, preserving the water isotopic composition in which these shells were growing. That will talk you about the seasonality. Okay. What we find a periodicity as usual, which is given by any natural, shells, which I have already shown you. And the inference what we make is as follows. First, as I said, that we find a lot of Terebrelia species, these shells, mangrove shells in Dholavira. They also find, the archaeologists, that some of the shells are cooked because they are burnt. The concentration of the shells are highest in the early to mature Harappan time, when the city was building very rapidly. During the later part, when the city was, city's expansion stopped, the concentration was less. Harappans obviously were eating these shells very routinely. And if they have to use it daily, they have to bring it from somewhere. If you look at the present day, what we call map of Dholavira, the Gulf of Kutch, Kori Creek, is more than 100 kilometers away. So they could not have brought it for everyday consumption from Gulf of Kutch, Kori Creek. It's impossible. So the only way is to infer that there must have been mangrove-like ecosystem around Dholavira in the Rann of Kutch in many areas. Okay? What kind of landscape and climate? We infer it would be something like this. That there were mangroves, there were mangrove waters, these Terebrelia palastrus were growing, these Dholavirans were collecting them, bringing them to the city, eating them, and after eating them, they were throwing as the waste, and which we are lucky after thousands of years to get hold of and retrieve about the climate. What did we observe? Our observation is as follows. There was a strong monsoon somewhere between 4,700 to 4,400 years back. There was a strong riverine system in the Rann of Kutch. Probably extensive mangroves were growing near the sea and river confluence. When we did some amount of estimation back of the envelope, we see that these water of the mangrove were brackish, meaning that there was some amount of seawater, but there was substantial amount of river water also. And our estimation shows that this river water had substantial component of glacial meltwater. So this is very funny. The glaciers were not there anywhere. They are not here, they are nowhere. The glaciers, if the glaciers are there, they are in the Himalayas. So what the glacial meltwaters had to do with these waters in the Gulf of Kutch? Okay? One thing is sure, that the climate was very good and the Dholavirans built the city and expanded it during this period of excellent climate that helped in large-scale rural agriculture. It was a kind of what you call, in an artist, view, this is what the then cities and the landscapes would look like. A sprawling city with a lot of business, okay, and a sprawling rural side where there is a fantastic agriculture is going on, okay, and the mangroves in the riverine system all around where the Terebrelias were growing. But then came around 4,200 years. When we study the Terebrelia parastris from this level, they show that there had been a catastrophic drought. Okay? All the isotope data indicate that the monsoon had disappeared. There was a catastrophic drought for about 200 years. And we suspect that probably this drought had actually caused or driven the city into collapse. Now that, given this inference, two important questions need to be answered. We said that there must be a river. Today there are not much river. What kind of river system it was? Most probable candidate is a distributary of river Indus that debouched into the Rann of Kutch. Is there any evidence of that? ISRO scientists have been doing a lot of, imagery studies. This is IRS-IC list 3 mosaic. They show very characteristically, this is your Thought Desert. This central part is the Thought Desert. You can see the Indira Gandhi Canal. And in the west part, you can see there is a sand body which is coming to south. They had defined it as a river course. They had, of course, given a name of Saraswati, and which is, as per our Rigvedic, hymns, the Saraswati river was flowing, which had a what you call glacial meltwater in it. Today it doesn't exist. You know about the conjectures, mythology, these, that. I'm not going into those controversies, but this is what they had observed. Now the question is that there are a lot of discussion. If you go in search of the river Saraswati or the river human settlement debate, you will see a lot of discussion. There were papers published by people who said that the river disappeared long ago. I just would like to show you one very interesting picture. This is a map of 1746, map drawn by or made by British surveyor at the behest of the Mughal Emperor Mahmud Shah. 1746, all major Mughal Badshahs were gone and Mahmud Shah was there. And he had given a job to this British surveyor to make this map. What do you see? Left hand side, look at red. You have the main Indus River. Right hand side, this is what is probable course of the river running parallel to the what you call Saraswati river. You also see, particularly here, as I am showing here, there is a connection between these two. And look at this, Dholavira is somewhere there. Okay? And look at this river. The river is coming and debouching into the run of Kutch. Okay? Is there any vestiges of this? Today, if you go, there is a river called Nara. Where does Nara originate? Nara originates somewhere in the uplands in the Pakistan. Today, Nara ends exactly at the border of India and Pakistan. Incidentally, when we have been working here, there is an army checkpost. It's very difficult to go, and many of our work could not have been possible without the help of these army people. But this Nara, just like we have, Narmada Canal, they had Pakistan side. They had also Nara Canal project. So today the Nara has been, the dam has been built on Nara, and today not much water comes across this side. Interestingly, if you look at the water of Indus today, even in this lower side today, all the study shows that substantial glacial meltwater input today comes. Why it comes today? Because Indus, as far as the water is concerned, it comes from two sources. One source, which is the dominant source, which is coming from the glaciers here, which is the high upland. So therefore, the glaciers melt and glacial water comes. And it also gets a hell lot of moisture for rain from the westerlies, which are coming from the Central Asia, Mediterranean, and things like that. Okay? Some amount of moisture is also, of course, transported by the Arabian Sea. But in spite of westerlies or Arabian Sea moisture component, the water isotopic composition shows that substantial meltwater is still coming into what you call is Indus. Now, this is of course possible that if Indus and Nara were connected, even as late as 1746, that is not impossible that during the Dholaviran times, the Indus Valley civilization time, which is 4,800 or 5,000 years to 4,400 years or 200 years, this river was debouching here, providing what you call an excellent mangrove ecosystem across the Kori Creek. Okay, and the Dholavirans had a kind of channels through which they used to sail through, collect the Turbinella apirums or what you call these Terebralia palustris, things like that, and bring them to the town. Okay, so in a way, this this study shows that indeed there is a possibility that there was a river mangrove system which was existing during this time, but this system completely collapsed around 4,200 years. Okay? Now, we say that there was an aridity from our studies, but was there a major drought spread over centuries? And those of you who must be keeping eye on the geological history, they know that in the last 2 years, a new age has been introduced in the geological time scale, which is known as the Meghalayan age. Okay? And this Meghalayan age suggests that around 4,200 years to 4,000 years, about 200 years, globally there was a major drought. It has been identified in India, principally first time it has been identified in the what you call the carbonates, Cape carbonates in the Meghalaya, okay, which is known as the Maumlu cave. Later on, it has been found across the subcontinent. It has been found in Oman. It has also been today found. It has been Laos and across the subcontinent and beyond. Okay, and these drought evidence forced the geoscientists to suggest a new age, which they had given a Meghalayan age. However coincidental it may be, it looks that Yangtze civilization, Indus Valley civilization, Mesopotamian civilization, Egyptian civilization, all across simultaneously collapsed around 4,200 years back. And the driving force could be this global mega drought, which had forced the civilization to collapse after they survived for nearly, 1,700 years to 2,000 years. If you look at all the Indus Valley civilization sites across India, okay, you will see that they start somewhere around 5,300, 5,500 years. They go up to something like this, and you look at this. This is your Meghalayan stage or the drought stage. Almost all the cities are either collapsing or kind of, excepting few places, kind of disappearing simultaneously. So this is the before the Indus Valley civilization Harappans. This is the early Harappans and the mature Harappans when they had flourished, and towards the late part of the mature Harappan to the late Harappan, all the cities had actually decimated. So they disappeared. So it is not only regional, it is global in nature, and along with the evidence what we find in the Dholavira and from the other sides, it is most likely probably a global drought had actually driven this large-scale decimation of the civilization across the subcontinents. One question, therefore, scientists have been asking that why the collapse? Okay? Why the climate change? One of the major reasons they have been finding is an abrupt reduction of the plant growth in the Sahara. People have been doing a lot of climate modeling. And as you can see here, this is a monsoon curve. This one is basically a monsoon curve, okay? So this dotted line is nothing but the solar insolation. And as you can see, these lines is basically is a monsoon curve. The monsoon was decreasing. That was all right. That was a natural driving force. But come some time when the climate system abruptly behaved. And during this time, as you can see here, suddenly the entire Green Sahara collapsed. And the Green Sahara collapse had triggered huge amount of dust throwing out in the atmosphere, which has been recorded particularly from the ice cores as it is shown here. This is from the Kilimanjaro ice core, and later on it has been recorded from many, many places. What it does, if you have a lot of airborne dust or what you call the aerosols, it changes the sea surface temperature and it abruptly shifts the monsoon. Okay? This is what principally people have been thinking, although there are many other kinds of models and things like that. I am not going into the modeling business, but this is an active field of research where people are thinking that this is a very excellent case where the climate system, which was gradually changing, can cross a threshold when there will be an abrupt change. And as you can see, when you can see that there is a sudden increase of aerosol and thereby, changing the climate pattern in the globe. Okay, this is a very excellent paper which was published in some time back last year. You can go to Green Sahara and Amplified Mid to Late Holocene Mega Drought in the mainland Southeast Asia in Nature Communications. Now, this brings us to a very interesting discussion. You have been listening to IPCC observations. They have been predicting about the increased frequency of the extreme events, including extreme rainfall as well as extreme drought. The red ones are basically the drought. This is from the earlier IPCC. I have not yet modified what they have done in the current IPCC, which has been reported just a few weeks back. But what they suggest and predict that within a century, there will be an extreme change in the climate, especially the drought will be increasing by many-fold. Okay? And they also predict that the change in climate, what we think will be gradual, may not necessarily be gradual. For example, there are many indications that by 20, 30, 40, the tropical marine ecosystem might abruptly collapse. Okay? If this is the case, then it is a matter of worry. What Dholavira presents is a classic case for understanding how climate change can increase future drought risk as predicted by the IPCC working group. That it is possible that monsoon will be weaker in some places, but it is also possible that an extended drought will abruptly come at certain areas. Okay? Whereas in other areas, the extended what you call flooding might cause in other areas. Okay? The question, of course, which is very intriguing, we have been asking now, is where did the Harappans go? Okay? We have been working in the Rann of Kutch. We find that there are evidences of settlements in the deep Rann of Kutch. Dholavirans left, I said, they came back after 200 years. They were not the Dholavirans, they lost their culture and things like that. So we ventured into the Rann of Kutch and we find that people are building small settlements here and there. We define them as climate refugees. And we think that these are the first, earliest climate refugees in the Indian subcontinent driven by the natural climate disasters. Okay? A kind, just mention few important things that is very, very important, that what we must do now. We have seen that is an excellent archaeological site. It has a beautiful history. Science tells us that there are many things to learn. But once we have got these global heritage tags, ICOMOS, International Council of Monuments and Sites, in their interim report, they have also suggested many important things. One of the things is that we must do continued research in and around Dholavira. They also want to know, or they're interested, what kind of research strategy is planned for the nominated property. They also suggest that further excavation must be done beyond the excavated city and the cemetery area. Today, if you go to the Dholavira, the major, mostly you find around the city area. But I personally am convinced, Dr. Beast says, that the city perhaps is much, much bigger than what we see today. Okay? We won't be surprised that it could be as bigger as Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, no one knows. But as you know that the excavation is a very costly affair, it goes for a long, long time, but that is what ICOMOS does. And I am sure that funding will be coming for that kind of excavation. ICOMOS also know very well that the present day, the tourist inflow, the site visitation is very low. Although Gujarat has excellent roadways, Still, the tourist infrastructures must be developed far more, okay, as happens in case of other World Heritage cultural sites. And therefore, they also want to have a kind of very concrete heritage impact assessment to be made over the coming years. So these are the things. So we have got, we are proud that Dholavira has been considered as a World Heritage Site, but this pride also comes with a price tag. We must do a lot of things in future so that it becomes one of the world's greatest monuments of mankind. Before I conclude, let me thank my collaborators without whom we could not do this work, be it the work of the Indus Valley site Dholavira or the Iron Age sites in the deep run of Kutch, Dr. R.S. Beast and Y.S. Rawat from Archaeological Survey of India, Dr. Naveen Jewel and Ravi Bhushan, who have been doing a lot of radiocarbon and vessel dating for us from PRL, Dr. Arati Deshpande, who had been studying these shell materials and who had been a connect between a technology institute and archaeological world from Deccan College, Pune. The most important people, Dr. M.J. Thakkar and Gaurav Chauhan of Kutch University, who are Kutch lovers. They study the Kutch geology and they keep on finding new settlements deep inside the Kutch. Without their help, this work just could not have been possible. We study a lot of plant materials from these remains, which is done with the help of the Calcutta University Professor Shubir Bera. And of course, we have a team of scientists and graduate students from IIT Kharagpur, Milind Bera, S.K. Bhattacharya, Kulmoti Ram and Tosha Sengupta. A kind of whole of teamwork and a bit of pieces we have been able to join together and make a story on the Dholavira till date. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, sir, for such a nice and enlightening lecture. Very exhaustive and very detailed lecture. Now, all the viewers, please, you can raise your question. You can write the question in the chat box. So I think if you have any questions, please write it in the chat box, please.
Sir, can I have one question?
Yes, sure.
Sir, my regards to my guide first. Amdasakar is my PhD guide. So I'm his past student. Sir, past PhD student. So, sir, can there be no role of tectonism here? Any because climate, yes, I agree, sir. And the sudden change, the sudden disseparation of the society can be also an abrupt changes. Looks a very abrupt change. So,
as far as Dholavira is concerned, yes, Kutch is a tectonically very active place.
Yes,
but I don't think till date there is a very major earthquake which was dated in 1889 earthquake or 19, I don't remember, 89 earthquake.
Allahabad, I think 1819, I think.
1819 earthquake, Allahabad earthquake. So, but apart from that, there is still no evidence that around 4,000 years there was a major earthquake in Kutch. There is no such evidence yet.
Sir,
And there is no such evidence yet. And along with the fact that this time duration, 4,200 to 4,000 years, the 200 years, this aridity has not only been found in Dholavira, this has been found in other, as I said, other Indus Valley sites also. Okay.
Yes, sir. What time I thinking is that, sir, if the cell growth is also can be linked within a year also, they are sensitive to the climate change. Even in the year it can be tracked. Suppose there is some sudden tsunami. Because earthquake is there, tsunami can be also there. Because all the major faults they are transgressing inside the coastal area also. They are transgressing the sea. If there will be suppose a sudden tsunami, then the seawater can come and engross they can also be very long time so there the cell growth can be, the cell growth isn't that in the tsunami water, in the marine water, if they can be, then they can be tracked with the oxygen isotope, with the cells. So there is some possibility that we can track the tectonic driven.
See, what we do as we do while studying the past climate is, that before you well, I didn't want to go into the detail of that, but before you go, you try to find out whether these shells are really recording the modern day climate or not. Okay, and that is what precisely we have done. That we ensured that these shells are recording the modern day climate. So if you look at our publications, that was the first thing we did, and then of course, if you look at the different cultural levels, you will see that the shells are not confined to only one level. The shells are found in all cultural levels, more or less. Maximum concentrations are when the Harappans were mature Harappan or the early Harappans, when they were growing. But the shell concentration comes down in the later part, meaning, activities become less, things like that. Now, tsunami and all, these are something like, event. These event stratigraphy need to be ascertained, and I am not aware about any study which shows that there was a tsunami around 4,000 years or so. Okay. See, any conjecture, I must tell you, any conjecture, it has to be supported by hardcore scientific data.
Yes.
Unless I have, because tsunami, if you say tsunami, the tsunami bed, sedimentologically speaking, it has a specific signature. Okay. So unless you have all the scientific data, it will be very difficult to, infer whether there was a tsunami or not. It will remain as a conjecture. Okay. I don't say that is not possible, but science advances stick by bits, and somebody has to show that there was a tsunami.
Okay.
Thank you so much, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, I have a questions, brother. I have a queries. When you were talking about the Eastern Gate, there was some pillar part was there.
Yes.
So from the pictures you have shown,
Yes.
it was so nicely machining. I would rather say.
Yes. In fact, if you look at the arc on either side of the pillar,
Yes,
they are
sir.
of exact size.
But this is surprising. I have a question. How they made it?
Yes. Excellent.
This is a. I would ask you to go to Google and listen to Dr. R.S. Beast. Few interviews are there.
Okay.
Even you not only these, for example, these pillars, but you will see even the houses. They have been built with mathematical precisions. Okay. Now you see, I am not really an expert to answer that about the architecture. Okay.
Right.
I really do not know, but it is indeed very surprising. I have shown you weight, for example.
Mhm.
Okay. They have weight from a very large weight to a very small weight. That means it triggers your mind that did they have some idea about the numbering system?
Yes.
Okay. Now I am no expert of that, so I just refrain from answering these questions. Okay. But certainly they had fantastic ideas.
One question from Rahul Sharma.
Yes.
Did the people of Dholavira moved from there? Is there any evidence of migration, or they just wiped out?
It is not only Dholavira, but it is also for other Indus Valley civilization sites also. If you go to the Harappa, Mohenjo-daro and all these places, Ganadiwala, everywhere it has been found that the cities had collapsed. But what happened? The rural sites had built up simultaneously. Okay. So it is possible that it was not possible for the people to sustain big cities, but more rural sites were grown at the same time. Okay, as I mentioned, that in Rann of Kutch, deep of the Rann of Kutch, we found 3,000 years old Iron Age site. Okay, and nearby there is an Iron Age actually smelting site also has been discovered. Okay, by University of Kerala Archaeology Department. Okay, so my question is that people must have been, and it is very well known. I mean, if you Google it, you will find that people have been migrating to the rural areas and settling down to smaller and smaller areas. Okay, but maintaining and keeping big cities were almost impossible. That actually, is a big warning to us. Okay, if the climate change takes place,
Yes, correct.
I really do not know what to do with my apartment in Calcutta. So this is a warning for the city dwellers. Okay, because in our case there may be some other things, may not be drought, but sea level rise and monsoon might be very devastating. Already you know that Sundarban is almost drowning, and they predict about a meter of sea level rise will drown even probably Calcutta. So question is that this climate change will suddenly, abruptly change. That is what the Dholavira record shows, or all the records of these archaeological sites show. And that is what is a very interesting thing to learn.
Okay, sir. We got one more question.
Yes.
One of our colleague from NCSM,
Yes.
Sri Rajeshri Bhattacharya, he wants to know, sir, till date we knew that Indus Valley civilization is a faceless civilization, but you have shown number of faces. I want to ask, what apart from climate change, is there any other major reason collapse of Dholavira?
As I said earlier, that people have conjectured, people have found evidences and inferred many things. One of them is interpersonal violence. Okay, that means the people are fighting among each other and they were killing each other. Okay, it's almost like what is happening in many parts of the Middle East. Okay, you can see Afghanistan is one of the current picture. There is other, as I said, that people were actually suffering from infectious diseases. Okay, so these are the publications which come with credible scientific data. Okay, for example, the study of the skulls and the bones by the top medical schools of the world at different places. They have actually published and they inferred. Okay, there are many such theories. For example, if you look at the movie Mohenjo-daro, okay, you will see that one of the things they say that it is because of flood. Okay, the whole movie is built as if there was a flood. Now, you see that nowhere in scientific literature that could be dramatic for making a movie, but in scientific literature, I don't think there is evidence that there was a flood all across from Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, and Pakistan, and all these places. I don't think that is there is evidence.
Not possible.
My point is that there are certain scientific evidences which are quite convincing. But then again, if you consider the interpersonal violence or what you call the infectious disease, I mean, in most likelihood, they are the outcome of climate change rather than they becoming a cause of the collapse. Okay, because if the climate change is there, if there is a drought, you cannot have agriculture, you have a resource crunch, and if there is a resource crunch, people will fight among each other. Okay, they will try to grab whatever little they have, and of course, when there is a climate change, resource crunch, the infectious diseases actually spread. Okay, so I think the climate is taking a stronghold in what you call in deciding the human culture relationship.
Okay, one more question from Rahul Sharma. Is there any connection or similarities between IVC and Ganga Plain settlement of megalithic and Iron Age after the IVC collapse?
What do you mean by settlement? I will give you certain examples. You see, I showed you Bengals, right? These Bengals you will find, in fact, there are Bengal factories which have been unearthed in many Indus Valley civilization sites. Okay, the whole factory has been buried. You will see thousands of Bengals at one places. Those were the basically, they call it, archaeologists call them as manufacturing sites. Okay. Now you see, Where is Dholabira? It's in Kutch. You will see that the Kutchis, Gujaratis, they do not wear the bangles. Who wear the bangles today? You will see the people, the ladies in Bengal and Bihar. They are the only people who wear bangles. Maybe some people from Odisha also wearing the bangles. But other than that, rest of the India do not wear bangles. When you look at the potteries, you will see the potteries, excellent pottery making still goes on in the rural side across the India. Okay, at many places. Okay. My take is that the culture is a continuous process. Okay. What was there in the Indus Valley civilization time that continued through generations through the Iron Age, okay, and subsequently, somewhere the culture remains and somewhere the culture disappears and new culture comes. Okay. For example, if you look at Gujarat itself, the subsequent to what you call Iron Age, you have the so-called medieval period and things like that. When the Indo-Greeks come for ruling, subsequent to that, you have these again the Hindu kings of Solanki take place, and then again subsequently the Sultanate and Mughals takes place. And every time a cultural change takes place, the cultural elements also changes. So somewhere you find one cultural element dominant, somewhere you find a mixing of the cultural elements at any one place. Okay. So it is very difficult to say that whether it is there or not. Yes, it is there in some form or other, or little transformative form. It must be there at many parts of India.
Sir, we have many more questions.
Yes.
Anisha Shah, he has two questions. How humanities student can get access to this kind of technology that you have shown us in the PPT? Because humanities students are unable to gain such technology knowledge here in India. It is a first question. And another question is, in respect of Calcutta University, use of technology is very much limited here for archaeological research. Can you please share your thought on that?
Now, what was the last question?
Another question is, in respect of Calcutta University, use of technology is very much limited here for archaeological research. Can you please share your thought on that?
Let me first tell one thing, that in today's world, I don't think increasingly people are realizing that this compartmentalization, that humanities, science, medicine, these are no longer there. Okay, all the fields are merging today. Okay. If you want to be a very good doctor, you need to learn a lot of medical equipment. If you are a historian, you need to know the intricacies of the carbon dating. If you are an archaeologist, you need to know a lot of physics of climate change and things like that. So I think there is no way. So the only way is to expand your knowledge base and learn new things. That is only one thing. And as far as the facilities are concerned, yes, I agree, because the facilities are not too many in India, but still I would say that today it is much better than what it was, let us say, 10 years back. Today we have a lot of facilities at different places. As I said that when I was a student in 90s, only one place used to do carbon 14 dating, or two places. One was PRL and another is the Birbal Sahni Institute of Paleobotany. And today we have so many places where they are doing dating. Accelerator mass spectrometer, which is very costly, maybe each equipment will cost some 20 crore or so. Today we have one accelerator facility center in Delhi, one in PRL, and so on. So I think it is continuously increasing, but it is, if somebody is a humanities student, I think don't confine yourself into the humanities brand. You try to learn the other aspects also, which is useful. Okay. Like I'll tell you, in IIT Kharagpur, for example, people take a variety of subjects. Okay, a mechanical engineer takes a financial engineering subject. Okay, a geologist will take a subject on rural development. Okay, and the knowledge has no limit. So if you think that something is very important for you, you must go, you must learn that subject, And then, of course, as far as the facility is concerned, you approach, and I think people will help you. We have been helping a lot of universities in our facilities, so there is no problem about that.
Thank you, sir. We will take two more questions. I know the time shortage of time. Madhur Jyoti Chakravarti, he wants to know, you have stated that importance of isotope tracers for understanding migrations.
Yes.
Recently, the study of ancient DNA has also been applied for deciphering migrations.
Yes.
Which, according to you, is more reliable?
See, in a way, DNA uses one approach. I did not deliberately go to the DNA because, I cannot cover in 1 hour so many things. DNA is a very, very important thing, and I think very interesting information are actually coming out. Isotopes are also extremely important. For example, it is not only the isotopes of carbon or nitrogen which can talk about the migration pattern. Actually, isotope and carbon and nitrogen gives you idea about the food habits of the people, or the kind of vegetation which was there. So far, if the vegetation in Mesopotamian region is one, and if the vegetation is the Indian region is one, the person who is traveling from Mesopotamia and dying in India, by using their carbon and nitrogen, you can tell that. Okay, that is one. There are other isotopes also. For example, strontium isotope themselves. The strontium which is there in the water in Mesopotamia is quite different than the strontium which is there in India. That also has been used. Now, you cannot say that one single evidence is superior or inferior to that. I would fundamentally prefer DNA much more because you are directly studying what was there in the human genetics, but 2 or 3 different isotope tracers and DNA all should tell you the same story. And that is what the science is all about, particularly the geoscience and archaeological science. So you attack a problem from a multiple sides, you converge, and then you infer. Okay.
Okay, sir. Mr. A. Roy, Dr. Avijit Roy, your first PhD student of Dr. Sarkar. Mr. Roy, you can directly ask your question to yourself.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much, sir, giving me opportunity. And in fact, it is our privilege to listen the fabulous lecture from, as usual, it is fabulous from Dr.
Yes,
Sarkar.
definitely.
Question too. Now, one thing I would like to question it. Except the Terrivelia, any other species you got from this? Because from the Terrivelia you were talking about the modern day environment, sea and brachycide environment, mangrove kind of things. Except Terrivelia, anything you got it from here?
There are many shells. For example, the Turbinella pyram which I showed. There are a lot of Turbinella pyram which they use for making bangles. In Bengali we call them shankho.
Yeah.
So shank they cut and they make the bangle. And that is going on, you can imagine that is going on for last 5,000 years. Okay. Now, but we could not use them because Terribelia is a marine species, Turbinella pyram. So that will give us idea about the oceanic climate. But our interest was essentially on the climate at the site of Dholavira, okay, on the land. So we are interested in the continental climate. We have done a lot of analysis of Turbinella pyram also, but very frankly speaking, I personally do not know what to do with them. Maybe some oceanographers will be able to use them, but I have not been able to sit down with the data and all. But they are there. But apart from that, Dr. Deshpande, I have got 1 or 2, but Terribelia is by far is maximum in Dholavira. Okay, is maximum as far as the land snail cells are concerned. And for obvious reason, probably they were using it as a daily food. Okay, so that is why probably they are found.
And another thing is that what type of drought you are talking about? This hot or the temperate?
What do you mean by hot and temperate? What is the fundamental?
Today's desert kind of thing environment. So if you take the temperature is very high, in the then what will be your proximity this ocean? What I mean to say, if the total global hot is because 4200 is the Meghalaya age, is a drought age, but it's a temperature. It's not the very high temperature.
I don't think it was a high temperature. I don't think the temperature changed significantly. What had happened is the moisture transport stopped. Okay, as I said, at least all the modeling study shows that you see monsoon was coming down anyway. If you look at the solar insolation, solar insolation was highest around mid-Holocene, somewhere around 8,000-9,000 years, and then the solar insolation was coming down, so monsoon was coming down. So monsoon was coming down, so probably it was affecting the rainfall. But in Sahara, what they think what had happened, that suddenly a tipping point crossed and entire green belt of Sahara collapsed. That's what I said, that abrupt change and crossing the threshold. And that happened, huge amount of dust suddenly was thrown into the atmosphere, causing the cooling of the Indian Ocean. Okay? So the SST change and so on and so forth. And subsequent the fallout of all kinds of stuff. Okay? So therefore, I don't think the temperature as such changed very much, okay? Because the insolation was coming down in a gradual fashion. But what had happened, it acted as a feedback, climate as a feedback. It acted as, see, for example, today we are melting the Antarctic ice sheet, right? Okay, today it is melting, tomorrow it is melting, we are Googling, we are Facebooking, WhatsApping, okay, this thing is very enjoying, very nicely. We just do not know if suddenly the tipping point crosses and there will be a massive collapse of the Antarctic ice sheet. Okay? It will take few months to be submerged, the entire Sundarban or the Mumbai. Okay? So that kind of feedback might be very important, and why this old climate record are important, they give you some idea that how climate system in the past had behaved in response to the climate forces. Okay? So that's all I can say.
Another thing, another thing, you have shown in the ISRO map, that old sandbar system you have given. But this trend is funny.
They say it Paleo channel.
A Paleo channel. But trend, if you see the trend is northwest southeast trending. If you see this,
actually, that channel is not new. The channel is detected by many people. It comes all around the western margin of the Thought Desert. Okay, all around western margin of the Thought Desert. And some people connect it to the right to the Ghaggar River, which goes to the Hakra, which goes into the Pakistan also, and things like that. I did not want to go to the Paleo channel business. There are scientists who have actually drilled in the Ghaggar Hakra, and they say that the Ghaggar was dried before the Indus Valley civilization altogether. Okay. But I do not really know what is it. But what I showed you, one very important picture, which is a historically recorded picture of Mughal period, that channels were actually there parallel to Indus River, which was debouching as late as 1746 in the Rann of Kutch. And in fact, if you look at many of the historical travelogues, okay, Huyen Tsang or many other people, you will see that Rann of Kutch had also, many people have depicted the Rann of Kutch had rivers, small channels which were debouching into the Rann of Kutch. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Roy.
Thank you very much.
I have did that.
You have one question?
Sir.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Sir, we both are students of, sir, you both are students of Sarkar, sir. First student.
Yeah, very, very old.
Sir, very nice to see you, sir. After so many days. How are you, sir?
Yeah, thank you.
How are you, sir? How are you, sir?
I'm fine.
Okay, fine, thank you. Before signing off, we'll take one question, last question.
Excuse me.
It is one of our colleague from Calcutta office, Rajashri Bhattaji, wants to know, like other Indus Valley civilizations sites, Dholavira also had many high brick wells. Many high brick wells. Well.
Huh.
What is the reason for that? He wants to know.
High brick wells.
Wells.
Why the wells? They dug the wells. That is the question.
I think like other Indus Valley civilization sites, Dholavira also had many high brick wells. Can you explain why?
I don't think I am competent to answer that, but I must tell you one thing, that the water conservation system which you see in Dholavira,
Right, sir.
okay, I do not think that kind of water conservation system you find anywhere else.
Exactly.
That is in general, okay? The reservoirs, the connectivity of the reservoirs, how to store the water, they were extremely conscious about the water conservation, extremely conscious. And very innovative thing. I have shown only few because the time was less. But if you Google through many of the interviews of Dr. Beast or go to these Dholavira videos, you will see they were extremely, innovative in water conservation system. That is not really found in, if you go to even Mesopotamia or even Harappa, and that kind of water. That only means that water became an increasingly precious commodity.
Right.
Okay, very precious commodity. I think, see, our study has not answered all the questions. Okay, it has only two things it has done. One is that we knew the cultural stages. We had given a chronology. That means what dates are where. That means when it started, when they grew rapidly, when it collapsed. That is the time we had given. And then second thing, we gave a kind of rough climatic framework. Now, for example, one student is doing PhD on a very high resolution climate and seasonality through Dholavira. Okay. Now, this is our second thing, that we go to a more refinement. Okay. That what was the real climatic force? Okay. These scientists from US universities have come up with a model of climate model that the end of Green Sahara was the cause of this drought. Okay. So we are trying to do with Indian Institute of Tropical Meteorology, likewise some kind of modeling to know, but with lot more data, that was that the only driving force, or there were any other driving forces which was causing that. So what we have been doing, we are not only analyzing the Terebrelia palustris, we are using other things. For example, you get fish ear bones, okay, in throughout the Dholavira. See, they were not only eating these Terebrelia, they were also eating fish, okay. And at least the Bengalis, Uriyas will know, when they eat fish, sometimes the fish head has a bone, okay. That is nothing but basically calcium carbonate, and they grow annually. So if a fish is living about an year, they preserve the climatic signal in that. So by using that, in using a laser, we are trying to find out the seasonality at different time scales. So that is our current project which is going on. So once we come up with all these, I think lot more things will be clear in the Dholavira.
Okay, sir. Thank you very much. It's a really enlightening lecture. We will be able to know many new things from you. And before signing off, I must say that this is a rather young group which is now working at Regional Science Center Guwahati. So thank you very much, sir. You give your consent. We are really touched for your gesture. Now I would like to request Suresh. He also part of this the entire whole arrangement, and he was the person first contacted you. So I must thank Suresh, and please you give the vote of thanks on behalf of Regional Science Center Guwahati.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Being a curator, Regional Science Center Guwahati, I deem it is a great honor and privilege to propose vote of thanks on behalf of Regional Science Center Guwahati and National Council of Science Museums, Ministry of Culture, Government of India, for this online popular lecture, UNESCO Heritage Site, Dholavira, Rise and Fall of 5,000-year-old city. First of all, I would like to thank our speaker and today's knowledge resource, Professor Anindya Sarkar, IIT Kharagpur, for giving his valuable time and enlighten us by his fabulous, exciting and informative lecture. I would like to thank our NCSM family as well for conducting and providing their support. Last but not least, I would like to thank our beloved audience for making this online popular lecture as a grand success. Once again, I thank one and all present here. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, NCMS and Dr. Majumdar, Mr. Suresh Kumar, and all the audiences, including my two students, as I see, Sarangi and Abhijit Roy.
Thank you, sir.
I am seeing them after a long